And good evening, everybody. I am back after a little bit of a hiatus between Bone and Zano, between Over the Cap, between everything, a move to Florida, move back to New Jersey, some health issues. We are back, and now we are going down memory lane. So before we get started, I want to thank two people, first of all. Down memory lane, sponsored by Storm. So I want to thank Kyler Jensen and all the guys over in Utah for putting their name on this and helping me out with this. And then a big shout out to my buddy in Michigan, JC Kramer. Um, Anything with the historical part of the game and collectibles and whatnot. JC was very adamant and very hands on in building the museum, the Bill Chrisman Museum um, in Brigham City, right on the Storm plant. So thanks to JC for all his help and support in getting this thing launched off the ground. So this show is basically going to be historical facts, story time, stuff from yesteryear. We're not going to talk about the modern game. We're not going to talk about what's going on in the PBA now and playoffs and the teams and all that stuff. We're not talking about that. We're talking about stuff that built the game of bowling. So my first guest that I wanted to bring on was Barbara Chrisman, and unfortunately, Mrs. Chrisman had some health issues and whatnot. So we have a very comparable first guest. This man, former touring player, he worked the truck for years on the PBA tour with Litchi. One of the most amazing minds in the sport of bowling. One of the most amazing coaches in the world. Knows the game in and out, knows bowling balls in and out, patterns, lanes, you name it, he has done it. So I couldn't think of anybody better to have as my first guest than the wonderful Billy Hall. What's up, partner? How are you?
I'm doing great, and I can't tell you how honored I am to be the first one on what I think is going to be a long-lived series. And I think people are really going to enjoy the conversations of the past because I always have this saying: you can't build the future unless you celebrate the past, and we have to celebrate the past.
I love it, Billy, and thank you for the kind words. And when I talked to you about a month or so ago and told you about this project, you were amazed and said, "I'm in. Like anything you need, I got you. I'm in." So I am excited to have you on. Excited to do this with you as the first one, and the evolution of the bowling ball. So I think we're all going to in agreement that the modern game is just bowling balls are round things with steroids in them, basically, right?
Oh,
But
there's no doubt about that.
but let's go rewind this 50, 60, 70 years ago. Wooden balls, rubber balls, plastic, urethane. When we talked yesterday, you gave me a fact about the wooden ball and the sizes that I had no idea existed. So why don't we start with that and we'll work our way chronologically through time. So, Billy Hall, tell me about the wooden bowling balls and the shapes and the sizes, and let's get it going.
Okay, so what people don't know is if you go back in time and if you collect the wooden bowling balls, what you'll find is they're different sizes. So when I first started working in a pro shop, some of the older people would say, what size can I get? And I always thought it was a strange thing until it was told to me that the wooden bowling balls, there was no uniform size. They made them lighter and made them the maximum weight by the size of the ball. We didn't have the technology to have different filler materials to make different lightweight, heavyweights. So they did it a lot by sizes. That didn't change until like the late 20s, 1920s, early 1930s, where mass production began, which was the most successful to start off with in mass production was the Brunswick Black Beauty, and I believe that was in 1933 or 1934.
So, the ABC or the American Bowling Congress back then, they never had anything, any kind of standard set in place. So, the size of the ball didn't really, there were no rules for the bowling ball back then.
Not really. I mean, there was, but there wasn't. When it came to producing, that's when they knew that you could do a lot more. You could be a lot more precise. You could be a lot more refined in the materials, and that's why the rubber. What people think is that a rubber ball was made with like a pouring of rubber. No, it was actually pieces of rubber that they would heat up around cork. That was the main interior, and the main interior was they would heat press it on there and then cut it down. So if anybody that's old enough remembers that smell, I've been around the factories when they've made the rubber balls, and the smell of them drilling them is nowhere near as bad as being there when they produced it.
The Manhattan rubbers. I was in a shop when somebody drilled one of those, and it stunk. It absolutely stunk the place up.
It's very every bowling ball that has been made, and forget the technology of everything like that. We're talking being produced in a factory. Every bowling ball that is been mass produced, like a Black Beauty, whether they consider it rubber, and whether you, when you move up to plastic, when you move up to urethane, when you move up to what we now call resin, all of them are petroleum based.
Okay.
So what's really happened is that petroleum, the knowledge of how to link the chemicals together and create different surfaces with bowling balls, is all based off of the byproducts of your of oil.
Hmm. Interesting. So let's go to the 50s. So we had the rubber ball, we had the Black Beauties, we had that. The evolution of the game, we had lacquer back then. So reaction, you really couldn't do much with drilling. It was pretty standard, right? A positive, a little negative. So how did guys like the Carters of the world and the Webbers of the world back with rubber, how did they manipulate balls? Like how did they use the balls to their advantage back then? Or was there even an advantage back then?
You know, it's the opposite because the surface was so soft when you had lacquer, shellac, and all that, and we're going to get into a little bit of that.
Hmm.
The surface was so soft that the harder the bowling ball's surface was, the better it was. So Billy Hardwick, who let's go a little mix up a little bit of stuff.
Okay.
Billy Hardwick, when he was throwing a mineralite, was Player of the Year. The moment he signed a contract with a manufacturer, that's when his career went down because the ball was too soft. So we were trying to get the ball down the lane then because we didn't have the way to apply applications of heavy amounts of oil. And so the surface of the lane was your friction. And the harder bowling balls rolled really good, like mineralites, the original Black Beauties. Um, you go ebonite tornadoes, and those are bowling balls that were literally bricks compared to today's bowling balls.
So I may be in the wrong era then. So you had said soft, so that's obviously before the soaker came in, obviously, right?
Oh, absolutely. Because we were trying to get when you go back and you talk to all the guys, and I tell you who's a wealth of knowledge. There's three people that the guy that taught me how to drill bowling balls, John Fantini.
Okay.
Um, Actually, there's a few people here. Barry Asher, who has an incredible knowledge of the game, Lynn
Hmm.
Nicholson, and Larry Lickstein. You can't get any better than those guys right there. And they all fed me information. It's like go back. We were talking about the lacquer and all that. Do you know where the term track came from when they were saying they were playing the track?
No. Tell me, please.
They would they would literally put down the base coat on the lane. They would put after resurfacing. They would put a secondary coat, and then they would take a tape, literal tape, put it on the surface, and then pull the top base coats two times over, so it literally had a trough in it. So they called it a track.
Okay.
So it literally already guided the ball a little bit towards the pocket. And I believe it was Brunswick was more like 8, 9, 10, and AMF was 11, 12, 13. So they would play around with the way that they laid the tape out as they pulled the materials, the lacquer, the shellac, so that it already gave like a track.
Huh. So it was like a ramp going to the pocket, basically.
Yeah, but only if it wasn't wide. It was only a couple, 2 to 3 boards wide. It's not like a wide piece anymore.
Yeah, it's
Like
not
compared to a lot
wall.
of yeah, it's not like a walled up. So the players that were smart enough knew whether to play further out or further in based on whether it was an AMF house or Brunswick house.
That's interesting. And it didn't matter where they were wood, so it doesn't really make a difference at that point.
No, and then so then when we started getting to more modern like applications of lane oil and stuff like that, that's when they had the B1 machine. And Billy Hardwick, to my knowledge, was the first one to figure out that the oil wasn't on the one board. So he learned how to play the gutter with a full roller, and a lot of people didn't know how to play it. So you got to give kudos to all these players that paved the way, that showed that there's more than one way to attack the game. Somebody like take Eddie Lubansky. Eddie Lubansky, the only player that ever shot back to back 300s on TV. And that was in the 1950, I believe, 57 or 58 Miami Newsday Herald tournament. He was using a hard rubber ball. He had one finger in and only his thumb. For that period of time, when he put his ring finger in, he revved the ball too much and hooked it too much for that era.
So that was the 50s into the 60s, then, correct?
Yes.
So let's go to the 60s. So Black Beauty, Black Diamond in the 60s, whatever Ebonite made in the 60s. And we transitioned, so rubber going into what? Plastic would be
Plastic.
the next. Plastic would be the next era, then, right?
Yeah, so in like the early 60s, Brunswick started making what is now known as the crown jewel white dot.
Okay.
We also had some at the early 60s. You had some Columbia, which not with the labels that are straight across. They were like a half a moon, and they
Okay.
said Columbia. So plastics again now all of a sudden they are all a form of a polymer based off of oil or oil additives. So they all of a sudden they became easier to produce with these materials, and you could make pretty colors which attracted more and more people. At first men bowlers didn't like them, they thought they were too feminine, and then once they start rolling and people started striking with them, that's when bowlers started getting onto it. It's to my knowledge that's when, outside of cork, the different filler materials, which are known as glass beads, they all have a different density to them. So you could hold a vial full of uh, glass beads and it would weigh less than a quarter of an ounce. A different type of glass beads, which is the filler material, the white stuff, then all of a sudden you had a different one. That same amount in a vial, the same size vial, could weigh an ounce.
Hmm.
So they started manipulating the weights of it that way.
That's so amazing. So all the games were played back then too, just not to the way
Oh,
it is now, though.
yeah. I mean, it's always been a battle, and you know the the real big difference between then and now is you had to manipulate the bowling ball much more then than now. To me, the bowling ball tends to manipulate the player.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So
That's
it's taken away and it's added some, but it doesn't take away the history of these. It's like go right here. Let's go with Earl Anthony, Mark Roth, because we and I talk quite a bit.
yeah.
Earl Anthony, Mark Roth, Marshall Holman. Let's just go with Don Carter, and let's go with Dick Weber.
Okay.
So all these players, I hear this all the time. They would never be able to compete in today's game. Well, they did things that wasn't normal back then. I'm sure if they were young enough and they wanted to adapt, they would find a way to adapt, whether it be throwing it thumbless,
Hmm.
two-handed, one-handed. They would have found a way to adapt. They were that good. So that's kind of a ridiculous statement that I hear all the time is, they did what they had to do because of the bowling balls back then. Well, just because they had to do, if they had to make those changes today, just because they did it one way then doesn't mean that they wouldn't learn another way now. Let's put it down to this. Every great bowler bent their elbow. What
Hmm.
is the biggest thing today?
Yeah, bending the elbow. That's one of the
Okay,
power.
so they did it then. So it's not like it's something new. It's just been added to, and that's a direct thing to all the bowling balls and the different constructions of bowling balls and the way that they're made now. And I mean, when you go about all of it, it's always been a battle between one thing and another: the physical versus the environment, meaning lane conditions, lane surfaces, and of course the bowling balls themselves.
That's amazing. It makes total sense. I love the comparison when you said that now people don't think those guys could compete now that did 30, 40 years ago. It's a BS statement basically. It really is. Um,
It's a complete farce.
here's our first comment, Billy. All that the best have now is ridiculous rev rates and ball speeds. The older guys can manipulate the reaction to change the middling roll or entry angle. What do we think of that one?
They
I got
okay.
that one for you.
Let's go with this today, because you can get away with so many different launch angles, meaning throw the ball going left to right at it's so many different things. Okay, now you're playing more, let's say 45 feet down the lane.
Hmm.
Back then you had to play all three parts, so the person's actually got a great point. You had to learn how to get it through the head so it rolled right in the mid lane so you could carry the pins in the back end. You didn't have a plethora of bowling balls to choose from. I remember just when I first really started bowling and following it, the guys walked around with maybe six balls.
Yeah, not anymore. Yeah,
No, they have six balls down on the lanes with
yeah,
them.
exactly.
So before it was, they walked like I'll tell you a person that was really fascinating to watch, and you and I had this discussion the other day,
Hmm.
was Mark Roth.
Yep.
Okay,
We'll just jump right
so
into it. Right to Roth now.
yeah, I mean we're gonna might as well talk. The
Yeah,
guy
it's yours.
invented and perfected the power game. Eddie Labansky was the first original power player that was successful,
Okay.
but he had to back down that power. Mark Roth was the first I'm raw power that just destroyed the racks for that time. A lot of those, back then, he would overpower the front part of the lanes, but his rev control was unbelievable. So when, I'll never forget one time I was watching him at a tournament, and I was still kind of new to the tour, and he threw the ball, and I watched him, and I could tell he threw the ball to a different point on purpose. And I looked at him and I said, area check. And he looked at me and goes, how'd you know? I said, because I've watched you enough. I know that you know how to lace it. And so plastics, when like yellow dots and stuff like that, he made yellow dots hit like urethane. And that's really one of the reasons that urethane came about is the manufacturers were trying to figure out how to get a ball to hit like what Mark Roth created naturally.
So, and I said this to you the other day. Roth made a plastic ball look like a urethane ball, and then he made a urethane ball look like a resin ball before they were even invented.
100%. And there were a few players that could do it. I mean, messengers nowadays, you see them with 12 pounders. Back then, you didn't see a
Yeah,
messenger. And when it happened, the big off hit back then was the 457 off the wall, and or the 5 6 10 off the wall for
the
the
lefty.
lefties. I mean, that's really was the big off hit.
And
And
a messenger is only a flat 10 if you really think about it. That's all
it
it
and
is.
that's and let's go to today's game, and
Okay.
I call it deck coverage.
Okay.
Okay, today's bowling balls, they hit the pins in such a way that the pins go lay down and go side to side. It only takes two bowling pins and a ball to cover the entire deck. If
Okay.
you hit them down at a foul line, and it didn't matter where you put the pins and you put the ball, between two pins and a ball, you've covered the entire deck. So if you get pins that are moving side to side and covering the deck, of course scores are going to go up.
Yeah. And
And
back
that's
then, nobody did that back then, obviously.
it was I the only person I ever saw do it was actually two was Mark Roth and Marshall Holman.
So I always thought this, Billy, and you brought up Marshall's name. Roth had more power, but Holman could outhook Roth. Holman hooked him more than Roth did.
I always put it this way:
Okay.
raw power and overpowering revs and everything like that. Nobody, and I even to today's game, nobody was better at that. Marshall Holman was an incredible slow hook player, just like Jason Belmonte of today.
Hmm.
He's not a good power player. He has a lot of revs, but his ability to really, I mean, throw it hard is not at the level that some of the other players are. But man, when he can slow hook it and keep that tempo,
Get out of his way. You're not beating him.
no, because he gets again the deck coverage goes so much, and it's really here's how I like to put it. Let's say you're bowling and you go nine count, nine count, nine count, nine count. And ridiculous comment I hear nowadays when someone changes a bowling ball is they say, and they'll start striking, they'll say, "What a great ball reaction."
We talked
Actually,
about this yesterday. Yeah.
yeah, actually, that's not true. You got a better pin reaction.
Mhm.
And that's the whole idea is how to get the pins to move properly. Everything's been moved to the point where we forget the objective. The objective is how are you going to move the pins?
And you want your ball
That's
going
the
through
objective.
the pins the right way.
And it's like, okay, go with the Asian spinner. They use an 11-pound, 4-ounce ball.
The Thai peas or Taipei, however you
Yeah, the
pronounce
Thai,
it. Yep.
the
Yeah.
Asian spinner, which
Yeah.
I learned how to throw. Okay, everybody says it's deflection, it's deflection. That's why it's effective. No, their pins lay on the deck and they are literally sideways chopping the entire deck. Well, of course, that means you're going to strike a lot,
So it's
and
almost
it's
like
going to
it's
keep
a
you out
can
of.
opener, basically.
It's basically a can opener, and when the ball hits the pins, the ball is moving right, but it's moving if you're right-handed, it's moving the head pin sideways, the three pins sideways, the six pins sideways. So you've got them literally knocking out row by row, not looking at them front to back. If you're standing to the right, you can see the different rows, and then that's why it's an effective way to score. And if lanes are impossible, and they
Yeah.
can be that way sometimes, it's still an effective way to score.
And Robert and I, Robert Smith. I'm pretty buddy. I'm pretty close with Robert. And Robert tells me all the time when he used to bowl overseas in Korea or China or Singapore or whatnot. When they got to be really ugly, you couldn't beat the spinners. They were impossible to beat because they just took the lane out of play basically. And Robert or Timmy or Barnes and those guys that went over there, they were dead against those guys because they had that trick with the spinner, however you want to call it. You couldn't beat them. They took the
Well,
lane out of
here's
play.
well, here's the deal. Let's just call it the bowling world right now is extremely spoiled. They want everything to be pristine and the lanes to be this way and that way and that way. Back in that time, back in in the 90s and stuff, you got to remember it's very, very expensive to bowl overseas.
Mhm.
And to get the latest technology with lane machines, oils, and stuff like that. So what we call burned, they call it fresh oil.
That's sick. That's really sick.
So they had to find another way. The one guy, the inventor of the Asian spinner, was YC Ma. Very very nice man. I met him, and I was introduced to him by a player from Malaysia, and we sat down and talked about it. And he was explaining the motion, and really, the only things that's changed at the foul line, let's get there, is the motion of the hand. And he was talking about the motion this way and the way that we were doing it and the power players. And over there, if you threw a plastic ball, it might make it, when they were not oiling quite as much as they are now, it might make it 30 feet down the lane before it went left if you were right-handed.
Hmm.
So it's all relative, and when you get to the bowling ball, it's just like talking now when you and I are just kind of going back and forth.
Mhm.
Um, the cores in the bowling balls, you go asymmetricals now, okay, which is basically a non-spherical, if you want to put it technically, or in an image, it's a non-spherical core. All right, so it has an odd shape or something outside of being symmetrical or pure down the middle. So when you look at those cores now, we have the technology, and I know this for a fact, that some are 7.5 pounds.
The cores.
The cores,
Okay.
so the weight block.
That's a half. That's half the ball if you're throwing a 15. So half the
If
ball
you're
is
throwing,
core is half the
yeah,
ball.
yeah, and when you go back in time, when they first mass bias has been around ever since bowling balls have been mass produced, so that's not a new thing. um but the puck or the weight at the top of the ball, which looked like a pancake, it really did, they were on average 6 ounces.
That's nothing. That's absolutely nothing.
In comparison of today, where you're talking literally 50% of the ball.
Yeah. All right. So let's backtrack a little more. I
Sure.
want to get into the 80s. I want to get into the urethane era. I do. So arguably in the 80s it was three manufacturers, right? AMF had the black angle, have FAB, whatever you want to call it, had the black hammer in the beginning, and then Columbia had the UDOT. So you put on a show from the 80s, that's all we're going to see, like from like what, 83, 84 probably? When did the angle come out? Like 83 probably? Is that when it came
81.
out? 81.
81.
Okay, even earlier. Okay. So what were the differences between the three? I mean, they all seem to be pretty similar. So you had a black UDOT, a black hammer, a black angle. What were the
O-
differences?
Okay, the AMF angle was basically made with the same, almost exactly the same material as what we had on the lanes at the time as a surface, which was Astrolane, which was a urethane coat. So what they did is they took the basically the same material and found a way to form it into a bowling ball. So the two materials matched up. So it created a tremendous amount of friction. The first one I ever drilled was for Casey Berry in Toledo, Ohio,
Okay.
and we weren't allowed to use them. We are trying to drill them for the next week. Um, Casey Berry, I watched him slap 10 after 10 after 10. And then when he picked up a plastic ball, he went week 10, week 10, week 10.
Okay.
So now we're already getting into back to the same thing we started with. The pinfall is the key. So all of a sudden we went slap 10. Now you go to urethane with the Columbia, their first one, which was the red U dot or the wine U dot.
Okay.
All right. That one was the first one that I knew that there was a different type of additive in it. The Fab Ball Black Hammer, it smelled like kerosene. So that one had a thick shell, which was unheard of. But let's go back a little bit. His name was John Randolph. They were called Randolph Classic Bowling Balls. and he had big cores in bowling balls, and they were clear. I remember seeing him in like the mid 1970s. So two-piece bowling balls were around before that, before the hammer. It's just that they were made with a material that didn't allow the core to be effective. So you went through all that, but when you got to urethane matched up to the surface of the lane, and the additives. That's when the additive war began,
Okay.
because there were different, like the um the black UDOT had fly ash in it. Fly ash in it is basically like, it's almost like a grit, and it comes from the soot, or it did at the time, of chimneys.
Are you serious?
I'm dead serious.
That's amazing.
So they used it as a filler material inside their cores to lighten them up, and then somehow they decided to put it into the cover stock. And now the red, the wine you got, I thought it was pretty good, but I didn't think it was a great urethane.
The black one was the better one, obviously. The
The
black
black one was, that was a contender.
that
And
made
then
that made careers for some guys.
oh, without a doubt, because every week it was basically a battle between whether there was going to be um, uh, Columbia black UDOTs or black hammers on TV.
What did Brunswick have back? Brunswick didn't what the GBT, was that what it was called?
Yeah, GTB.
GTB, that was it. Yeah, that
Okay.
was all they really had before the Rhino line came out, right? But the Rhino
Yeah,
line was
they
like later in the '80s.
yeah, and the Rhinos, they had there was a guy that was running the plant, and I don't remember his name. Johnny Petraglia actually invited us, Larry Lickstein and myself, and we went to the plant, and we're looking and we're going, well, something doesn't add up here. So we walked through the plant several times and watched them produce bowling balls. And I said, well, wait a minute. I saw somebody accidentally drop a core that was had no cover on it.
Okay,
And it just made a weird hollow sound. So our suggestion to them was to firm up the core and lighten up the cover. So the core and the cover were too much alike. So they were not getting the delay in motion. They were rolling too early, so that sat them on sitting on ring and tens. It's like when we went, and I don't remember the exact year. I believe this was '84.
okay.
Larry Lickstein and I went to uh, Ebonite in Erlanger, Kentucky, and they had what they call a wet weight block or a splash weight block. So the wet weight block was a pancake weight block, but it was still wet when they put the filler material on it. So you could drill it, and there wasn't a solid weight block to it. So when they poured the filler material in it, while the wet weight block was still curing, it would splatter. So you could drill a ball, and it would you could drill it, lay it out for a half positive side, and it could end up zero positive side or an ounce positive side, because you didn't know where the exact densities were because they weren't centered enough.
Billy, when we talk about the balls like the angle and the hammers and the U dots and whatnot back in the '80s, were the incentives good for these guys to throw them on TV? Were they pretty lucrative back then? Totally off the topic.
Unbelievable,
Were they
unbelievable, unbelievable.
really?
Yeah, it was the highest on the board for a while was actually Fat Ball, which I ended up going to work for.
Dennis Baldwin.
Um, yeah, so theirs was the highest on the board for a little while. Then all of a sudden, the urethane ball war started. Uh, we we had basically every week there was 3 to 4 out of every ball on the TV show was hammer black.
Yeah.
So then Brunswick really came out with a couple of good rhinos at that time.
Mhm.
And then AMF was really pushing with the uh, banana color one.
The
And
mustard one, the mustard angle.
yeah, the I can't remember the name of it, the yellow angle or whatever it was,
Don,
golden angle.
yeah, Don Janello liked that thing a lot. I think he was the only
And
one that liked that one.
yeah, but all of a sudden there was incentives everywhere.
So guys took the money to throw a different ball on the show just for the money, basically.
Well, sometimes there was more money on the wall for incentives than paid first place.
Wow, wow, and that's not like that today. You're not doing that.
Oh no, not. I mean, even now, they're back in the early '80s. They were paying 35,000 for first. A lot of the
Yeah.
tournaments now are paying less than that.
Oh, well, it's a joke. Well, we're not going to talk about that. We know that's a joke.
You
Um,
know,
so what were the you talk about like the angles, right? So we had the black angles, arguably the best ball they ever made, AMF, right? The U Dot's
I
probably
think
arguably
so.
the greatest ball Columbia ever made, right?
Yep.
When they introduced different ones, so like we had the blue angle, we had the gray ghost, right? We had the yellow one, then we had the black U Dot, the wine U Dot. Then you go to the hammers, had the red hammer, you had the pink hammer, had a and then the blue one. So what were the what were the differences, or was it all just like structure of the ball that made them different, or was it color that made them different? And the blue hammer is special. We'll talk about that one in a little bit, but like, what were the differences? Were there differences between all these other pieces, or they're just colors?
No, 100% there were differences. The differences was in what they call the isocyanate, or basically the catalyst. So they could take the catalyst, which created the curing of the bowling ball, and you could create different porosities by how fast it cured or how slow it cured.
Okay,
And we're talking literally 3 to 5 seconds.
for the ball to cure, you're saying?
No, the average back then was 16 seconds, but if you made it go cure in 13 seconds, it would still be hot, but the material would be hard. Then it would be one thing. Then if you went 18 seconds, it would be something else.
Interesting.
So a lot of it was done that way, and then they started putting in additives such as fly ash. There was even walnuts inside, ground walnuts inside the LT48. So it's all been a game of, how do we control the friction of the ball, and how do we do this and how do we do that. A lot of it, once the additive game began, that's in my opinion is when it got out of control.
So we're gonna talk about out of control. So do we want to go into the champions era, which you were very involved with? I know you had your
Let's go.
hands, and that was you.
Let's go. Let's go with the blue hammer.
Okay, let's start with the blue hammer. That's arguably
Okay,
the greatest ball ever created. Mike Machuga will argue that with anybody. So talk about the big
it's
blues.
all right. So what we did there, and that one took 16 tries to come up with the formulation.
Okay.
My hands were all over that formulation.
Okay.
And what people don't know is if you go way back, if you go back to the 70s. Now, I've always been one that studies all this stuff and just kind of keeping an eye on it. There was a what they call a Shore D Pro.
Yep.
Okay, that was early 70s. There was literally a sticker on it that said that the ball had no warranty. It also mentioned a resin.
Okay.
So what I remembered that. And when I started working for Hammer, I said, well, why don't we put some kind of tactifier in it so that when it wasn't a pure urethane, what everybody was chasing. They were looking for a better urethane. My choice was to add a tactifier to it.
Okay.
And that tactifier created a friction that porosity did not.
Okay.
So what people don't know is blue hammers, after a while, they would not get oil soaked, but the tactifier would wear out. It would take a lot of games. Not we're not talking 20, 30 games. We're
It
talking
wasn't
a
like a
few
sponge
hundred.
like it is now.
Yeah, it wasn't even close. It would take a few hundred games, and all of a sudden you'd see a different reaction.
So
And
what was the difference between like so the blue hammers, right? Like the three Bs on the serial number, right? Like the three Bs or the nine Bs, right? So what was the difference between those? Like I always see Machuga online talking about his 9B, I think it is. But what were the difference between them?
okay, the 9Bs, what happened is we added too much additive. I
Okay.
mean, so that ball came out, it heats up differently, but it'll come back to its texture. And then what happened is we were in Florida because now I'm working for Fab full time,
Hmm.
and we had already had 9Bs. We're in Florida, and the salt air and the heat, the balls are in the truck. All of a sudden, we went from Dallas, and they were fine, and then we went to Florida. They went from 77 to 73 hardness. Some of them survived and they stayed above. So there was, you got to remember, all the manufacturing isn't nearly as precise as it is now. I mean, we were as good as we could be back then, but there were definitely some batches that we were like, I don't
Well, there's always going to be that. Anything you manufacture, there's going to be a bad one, the batch, right? Or a bad batch
know.
of something.
Absolutely. And it's like when we started, okay, urethane pearl. We were told that you couldn't pearlize a urethane ball.
Not true.
So back then we used it was called a mica. It was called aluminum oxide, and it came in different grades. Literally, like some of it could look like pebbles and some of it could look like talcum powder.
Okay.
So what we did is we used the talcum powder one.
Okay.
So it gave a bigger swirl, which gave it. We were able to make the ball harder, so it shot through the front. But the aluminum oxide, which even to this day I don't think it should be allowed anywhere near a bowling ball, because it is a metal. I know it's an oxide, but it creates grit. So we were experimenting with that, and the blue dyes back then. Now they use more of a paste in majority because it's cheaper. Back then we used dyes. So the dyes, it's like this right now. If you looked at your credit card, they're all white in the middle. There's a picture over the top on the
Mhm.
front and the back. They're not that color. They are literally pressed with a picture. Why? Because
I think
every
it's fair.
every dye has an adverse effect and a chemical reaction to another. They would have to make a bazillion different white cards and then uh, experiment far too much to make various changes in credit cards, bank cards, or anything like that. They do it by keeping a card white, and then they do an overlay of a picture on the front, a picture on the back, and you don't have to worry about dyes.
All right, we're gonna go to this in a little bit. I think we'll get back to this stuff and this question in a little bit. So we talked about not the Blue Hammer. When did champions come to the forefront? And for those who don't know, Billy, the founder, president of Champions, is that accurate?
I was one of the founders, and that
One
was
of
in
the founders of
'93,
Champions. So
and that was
what was Champions? For those who don't know, I know what it is. I know what you made, and then I know who was involved. Duke, Warren, Dell, um,
and myself.
and yourself. That was it. The four of you, right?
Yeah, Dave Ferraro was involved at the beginning, but then decided that it wasn't for him.
Okay, so please tell us what was Champions.
Champions was the only ball company that was owned by the players, and um, it was our. We were. I was being told my hands were tied working for Hammer, and I had other ideas. So the players and they put their trust in me. We decided that maybe we should make our own.
Mhm.
Now, here's the weird part about that. Our very first series, the weapon. Okay, when we did the ball test, there were two cores there. One was a bigger one was a smaller one. When we went to production, somehow, by mistake or otherwise, I'll never know, the smaller core was made and we all agreed on the bigger core.
Okay.
So it wasn't exactly what we tested, but we still were very successful. Then we hit with what was the pink ultimate weapon.
That was a pretty special bowling ball. Duke won the tournament champions with that bowling ball.
And that ball was my expansion of the blue hammer.
Okay.
I went a step further. And immediately following that, we had the explosion of the resin series.
Ah.
So, right when we came out with it, within 2 to 3 weeks, was the explosion of the Excalibur was already around, but nobody had really gone to mass producing. And then all of a sudden, the explosion of the resins. And we were working with, we had a contract with Fab Ball Baltimore, Maryland, that they were to be our only manufacturer.
So that's who was pouring the balls for champions was Maryland.
Yes, and that
Okay.
was the urethane series.
Yeah.
And then once that contract ran out, we were able to go to other tournaments or other manufacturers. That's when we jumped from there to Columbia,
In San
which was
Antonio, right? San
in
Antonio.
San Antonio. So it's, you know, it's, we were on the right track and we had the right idea. And I'll never forget the wisdom of Del Ballard ever. We were in Ohio, and the owner of Fab Ball came because we were obviously not real happy that we weren't able to make a resin. And he said, "Well, there, our testing doesn't show this and that." Del Ballard, he said it better than I could have said it. He said, "But the resin ball makes the lane look the same, so they're getting 3 to 4 frames ahead of me every game versus urethane." In other words, the resin would slap 10, the urethane might bucket, then weak 10. So you were moving on the lane and making more adjustments than what was happening with the resins. And he said it better than I did. So they are gaining 2 games per block on me.
And for those who don't know this, the Excalibur was the first resin ball that was introduced, correct?
It was the first one, but
But
but there's a but here.
there's a big but here, and I didn't know
Oh
this until
man,
yesterday.
we had the resin ball
Hmm. And when you say
at
we, you
Hammer.
mean Fat Ball had it, Hammer had it.
Fat Ball had it. We had it, but it was deemed that they were too fragile to make. I was literally thrown out of a meeting because I'm very passionate.
Yeah.
I was screaming at the top of my lungs, telling them that they have to make it. And used the example of this. In 1975, the 5P Yellow Dot, arguably the best plastic ball ever made. The 5P Yellow Dot. In the mid 70s, people were paying $200 to $300 for that ball, even though it was breaking.
Back then they were paying that for it.
Yes.
Jesus.
So you're talking, you're in the 90s now, and they felt that it would be too difficult and it wouldn't be the quality that they had control over. And then that material left the building. There's different stories of what happened, but I can tell you that next thing I knew is I saw the Excalibur and I said, That's what we should have been making all along.
And Mark McDowell was the first one to throw it on national television. Am I right? Am I right with that?
AC Delco Championship, California, Torrance.
And he threw the one ball, and anybody wants to go look at it, can go look on YouTube. He threw a pin across the deck that's probably still flying. And Marshall, he's ball Marshall. And
Yes.
Marshall looked, and Marshall had the look of like, what am I watching? That was never there. So now let's go to the transition to resin. So now resin's it's on the forefront. It's here, right? Guys,
Resident.
well, guys struggled with that transition. The switch, right, from going from urethane to resin. So what was the biggest change that these guys had to adapt to, or they couldn't adapt to? Was, let's be real, resin killed some careers, and we'll talk about this now. Resin also made some careers. So what was the biggest difference going from urethane to resin?
Okay, this is not going to sound nice, but it is accurate.
Okay.
Urethane made people that had really good releases with plastic bowling balls. They already had. I mean, they were already good at their motion through the ball. Urethane made it better. So they took great releases and made them better. Once reactive resin came out, it took crappy ball motions and ball revs and made crappy ones better than the good ones that they were producing on their own.
Billy, who is your opinion best urethane player?
Whew. There was a few. Okay, you have to put Ron Palombi in there without a doubt.
Okay.
You have to put Mike Albee in there. You have to put golly,
Can I give
you would
more?
have to put Pete Weber in there.
Can I give you two actually?
Sure,
Ozio and Webb,
without a doubt.
and Dell, obviously with Dell.
And Dell Ballard is my personal opinion one of the most underrated players to ever throw a bowling ball. People
Okay.
know he was good, but I don't think he ever really got the respect that he deserves. Just a personal, you know,
Okay.
his knowledge of the game, his knowledge of adjustments, and yeah, some of it, I taught him as much as I could. Some of it he taught to me. That was the great thing about the group I had. I get a lot of credit for their success, and that's nice. But it was Chris Warren, Del Ballard, and Norm Duke.
There should
They
be three
weren't,
Hall of Famers.
yeah, they weren't champions before I started working with them, except for Norm. Norm had won once.
Mhm.
Um, but there was such a rapport between all of us that nobody got our egos in the way. We were learning from each other constantly. How many nights I spent with Norm Duke in his hotel room talking about ball rolls, angles, blah, 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 swing planes, walk patterns. And the same with Chris Warren about because his biggest flaw was the swing coming in steep, so we had to really flatten out the bottom of the swing. And he's also a player that he made plastic and urethane look the same. It was unbelievable how good he was.
So let's get back to the guy we talked about before. So let's go back to Roth. So how did urethane kind of benefit Roth, and then how did resin hurt Roth? I thought resin killed Roth. I did.
Well, urethane benefited him because his off hit, he opened his ring intent all of a sudden became carry
With urethane.
with urethane.
Okay.
But the moment um, resin came out, he was getting older and his ball speed was definitely down. There was no, I was there, so
Yeah.
I know. And his biggest, if you want to call it a flaw, was when he yanked it or pulled it in. When I say yanked it, we're talking a board, not like three or four boards.
Mhm.
But when he tugged it up, urethane and plastic would sit and trip four or slap 10. Now all of a sudden he was at an angle, playing the lanes differently because of the motion of reactive resins. And all of a sudden, when he tugged it in a little bit and over revved it, it would go through the face.
So I don't want to. I don't want to stir the pot too much, and I don't want to come off standing like that and get people in trouble and whatnot. Who is the one that really like benefited the most from resin, and who is one who was hurt the most by resin? And I
I,
have a couple of guys that I think were hurt by resin, and I'll throw a name out. May I?
yeah,
Mark Williams.
Mark Williams, Ron Palombi,
Yep.
they got crushed.
Even Dell. Dell got crushed with it too.
Del Ballard got crushed.
Pete,
The
Pete
one
got
that
beat up too, but Pete learned how to bowl with it. It took him years to adapt to it.
it took him about 3 years. I mean, he was still making the finals, but he couldn't keep up. All of a sudden, that higher speed with that type of rev wasn't holding back. And then he had to learn to bring the speed down and rotate it away from the pocket differently.
What about Ferraro?
And Ferraro, oh God, was he good? I watched him at the Firestone Tournament of Champions. The lanes were on fire. This was, I think, 1985. He made a yellow dot strike like unbelievable. So he just kind of went through it and just kind of covered. He was just a really smart player.
He
So
had to learn.
I don't think it hurt him or helped him. I think it just kind of, we were in Chicago and he was throwing the ball, and I'll get to a story with that, and I'll have to be careful. He was throwing the ball, he was throwing urethane, and rhinos were really starting to become popular.
Okay.
So he throws the ball, looks at me, and he goes, I can't beat him with this. And he was throwing one of our weapons. And I looked at him and I go, no, you can't. He went into the locker room, grabbed a rhino, and basically just started running away with it. So, and that rhino resin. So he was a smart player. Um, but a little side story to that, which Johnny Campos can definitely verify because he was there. At that point, I was saying that the bowling balls were absorbing oil, talking about the reactive resins. And there was a company that literally threatened to sue me because they said, no, you're falsifying the our advertising, because they were advertising the longevity, blah, blah, blah. And I said, no, they're absorbing oil and it's going to cause them to lose their efficiency. And I was threatened with a lawsuit. Literally, I was threatened with a lawsuit by a major manufacturer at the time.
Mhm.
And later, they came back and dropped the lawsuit because I was proven right. So there's a lot of ins and outs to this industry, but one thing, I've always spoken the truth, whether people like it or not. I don't care. But you asked, and we'll even get to this right now. To me, the player that benefited the most was Walter Ray.
Everybody says that. Everybody says that. But he was Player of the Year in '86. He
But I'm talking overall. He benefited the most. Norm Duke benefited, but Norm Duke benefited because he played the game differently.
It's
But the
almost like
players that
Norm had like two careers almost.
he had definitely two careers. He had immediate success, and then he came to me. I think it was 91 or 92. I was working with Chris, and this was in Seattle, Washington. I was working with Chris Warren and Mark Thayer, who was an unbelievable
Oh,
player.
Thayer got a handful. He strapped on like
Yeah,
a ton. Yeah.
yeah.
from our
there's a guy that resins killed him. Um, and I was working with him, and people, if you're gonna ask me, I'm gonna give you my opinion. I don't care whether you like it or not.
Mhm.
And Norm walked up and he saw me working with Chris Warren, and we were talking about swing lines and stuff like that. And Norm goes, "Well, what are you guys working on?" So I explained it, and he says, "Well, I'm gonna win again." And I just looked at him and said, "Not with the game you got right now." And it wasn't meant as an insult.
Yeah,
And people get, because I speak the way I speak, people take it as an insult. It's not an insult. you
accept
know
constructive criticism. Is that the right phrase?
yeah, it's just, I'm telling you that, with the game you got right now, there's no way. So he walked away mad, and then about 45 minutes later, he came back and he says, "Okay, so where do we go from here?" And whether I'm blunt, whether people take it as abrasive or whatever, if you're going to ask me, my mother taught me a very important lesson. If somebody's going to respect you enough to ask you a question, you have to be respectful enough to give them the answer.
Agreed. That's a very good point.
And I've always lived by that. And, like people go over, well, I told Dick Allen that he's a typical house bowler. Well, when I watched him, he was. He made a lot of changes.
Yeah, very underrated player too, Dick Allen. Very underrated.
Yeah, and he struggled for a long time until he started making those changes. You have to, it's like Chris Warren. When I first met him, little backstory there. He only came out for a couple weeks, and he didn't really have a lot of money. I said, "All right, tell you what, I'll back you the next few weeks."
Okay.
And I was in the truck, so we weren't really supposed to do that.
Yeah. A conflict of
you know,
interest.
yeah, but I kept it professional. I didn't go down there and do anything outside of what I needed to do. And I told him what he had to work on when he went home.
And he
Then
did.
he comes back. Then he comes back with a sponsor and makes 150 grand. I could still to this day kill him.
Yeah, let me give you another name that I think resin kind of eliminated. Great urethane player, Tony Westlake.
100%.
And anybody I talk to says anybody needed to throw a ball for the money, Tony Westlake was your guy. Ice water in the veins, never flustered. That was the guy. Is that true?
100%. He just, you know, there's two that go with that, and that's Danny Wiseman as well.
Okay.
Danny Wiseman is a unique animal.
He's a great human being, by the way. I love Danny.
Oh,
Great,
unbelievably nice guy.
wonderful human being.
We still talk pretty much every day or every other day. We still chat.
Big cornhole player, Danny. Now,
Yeah, and with
did I lose Bill?
his
There we
palm literally looked like it was facing to the ceiling, and it looked like he was carrying a pizza. So, but when we refined his game, he still gives me a lot of credit. Again, I can only lead you to the path. It's up to you.
It's up to you to put the work in to get there, right? You can only lead the
And
horse.
and
The horse's
and
water.
that guy worked his butt off. But if you want one for the wheat, he's somebody I would definitely pick.
I always heard it was. I never thought of Wiseman. I always thought of everybody. Always said Westlake was the guy.
What
So
Westlake, Wiseman,
Roth, obviously.
Roth was, you knew he was going to pure it.
Albee was another one.
Absolutely.
Now Albee never really got affected with that. So I think Albee is one of the greatest lefties to ever, or one of the greatest bowlers to ever throw a bowling ball. Period. But
100%.
he won with everything, right? He won with plastic. He won with urethane. And then when resin came out, he didn't really struggle that much with the transition. He didn't.
No, he did not. It's interesting
I think we're losing Billy again. Oh,
We were at the Brunswick World Open in Lake Zurich, Illinois,
hmm
all week. I had drilled two bowling balls for him. One with people didn't know a lot about the pin placements and all that, and I'm going to get to that in a minute.
hmm
But so I drilled him two different black hammers, two different pin placements, and I said, "Here's going across the house," and he led the tournament. Now comes to the TV show. Albie was always in for drilling up a new ball for the show.
Okay.
So he comes to me and I said, I always called him Michael. I said, Michael, um, I have an idea because the heat, the lights, and those are all things you had to take into effect back then because the lanes weren't synthetic.
hmm
And I said, you may not like it. And I said, I'm going to drill you two different balls, and they were AMF angles. We drilled out two different balls. Both were one was positive leverage, the other one was negative leverage. And I said he ended up using one on each lane for the TV show, by the way, and
Okay.
he won. Okay. Oh my God, did I got in so much trouble with the manufacturers because I took a ball off of the TV show. But I was asked what I thought would be best. And I didn't think that even if we drilled up two new black hammers, that they would be the ones to make it.
hmm
There was just something about that pair. I don't remember it exactly now, but I said, that pair, the hammers just aren't rolling that good on that pair.
Topography.
Yeah. And, it's like everything now. A guy named Raleigh LeClaire, who I learned from how to oil lanes in the late 70s, he's the first one that we now call it topography. Back then, we called it lane shape.
Okay.
He was the first one to explain to me lane shape, how the shape of the lane is different from one lane to the next. I had no idea because I had only started bowling in 1975.
Okay.
So, all this stuff has been around for a long time. It's like, you know, the one that I learned a lot about ball layouts from was two people, and that was Richie Spizzato and Bud Horn.
Hmm.
So people don't know they were mad scientists.
W-
But I was already laying out balls with extra holes and putting them in certain points and different angles in 1977 to 1978.
All right. I want to give you one.
Okay.
And so we talked about guys that helped with resin, that were affected by resin, urethane, better urethane players and whatnot. And we talked about this guy yesterday. I want to give you an amateur, never bowled on tour, and who I think and many think is the greatest amateur to ever walk God's green earth. If he would have bowled on tour, he probably would have had a Hall of Fame career, most say. And unfortunately, the demons got in the way. So I'm going to ask you, Billy, how good was Michael Newman?
Incredible. And we shared this story before, and I want people to know this is not scripted. We're just
Yeah,
talking.
yeah. Mike Newman, I think, and I saw Mike probably like the early 2000s before he kind of went away, and he was still really good. But back in the day, Newman was the best, and those mega buck guys like Barnes and Robert and Healy, Rudy, they all say it too. Mike was the best of the best, right?
He's
So
he he's the only amateur that I sat down with when I started talking about the way the pins were falling. And to me, the whole game is pinfall. The rest of it is going from there backwards to the player. He's the only amateur I ever met that knew exactly what I was talking about.
and it didn't matter what was in his hand. The transition of the ball, right? From urethane to resin, it didn't help. It didn't hurt Newman at all. He made the urethane ball look like a resin ball before it was invented.
His hand motion and he had the bent elbow of Earl Anthony. He had the hand motion of a combination of three players, my opinion. Jason Belmonte, Marshall Holman, and Mark Roth.
That's a hell of a
He could
combination.
do all. He could do all three of them.
And Newman looked terrible going to the line. He
Oh,
did.
he looked like a duck out of water.
He's not Brian Voss or Ozio going to the line. He looked terrible, but his last two steps were absolutely incredible.
It's like Mike Lickstein.
Well, we'll talk about Lich in a minute too if you want.
Oh, absolutely. He's arguably the greatest amateur left-hander I've ever watched, as unorthodox as it can be. But the last two steps are textbook.
And that's what Newman had.
Exactly.
And for
You
those
know,
who
it's
don't know, how many Eagles did he win in the 1 year? Three
three,
in 1 year.
1 year, one event, 1 week. He
Team
was there
USA,
for.
all the mega
Oh,
bucks
he
stuff.
was, and just watching him calculate was.
So he had a brain in his head too. Like he knew the game. He wasn't physically gifted, like natural ability. He also understood it up here. You're saying.
He 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 calculated, he understood what to do, when to do it, how to do it, had the ability to do it. And here's a weird thing, and I don't know if this is proper or not. He's the only guy I've ever been around that, whether he bowled good or bowled bad, never bitched about the lanes.
Yeah, that's very uncommon.
Never once did I ever hear him say, oh, they're so walled up, or oh, they're so hard. Not once. And I was around him quite a bit at the high rollers because I was bowling a few of them at the
Mhm.
time. And then
Billy,
he came out
if he bowled on tour, would he have made it?
100%.
No questions asked. He would have made it 100% going through the
No,
generations.
without a doubt.
Okay, then let me ask you this one. So everybody always says, what's your Mount Rushmore and who's your top five players and whatnot. So let's break it up a lefty and righty. So, and I argue this with everybody. Everybody said, "What's your top five left-handed bowlers ever?" I said, "Well, it's easy. It's Earl, Parker, Albee." I put Couch in as number four, no particular order. I'll put Couch on the list, and I put number five as Mike Lickstein. And people say to me, "Well, how do you put a guy who never bowled on tour?" I said, "Simple." I said, "I think Litch is probably one of the greatest left-handers to ever throw a bowling ball, ever. His accolades speak for itself." Would Litch have made it on tour if he bowled on tour?
Physically, I think he would have. Would he have been as dominant as he was as an amateur? I don't think so.
Is that because the talent was weaker in the AMs, or the talent is better on
No,
tour?
he was just, he had that weird instinct, and there were just certain players that had it. That when they bowled you heads up 1-on-1,
Mm-hmm.
they had a total different focus versus when they bowled in tournaments. You know, yeah, he's won a ton of them, but he didn't have the patience to wait every week for your turn to throw the shot.
He was a sprinter rather than the marathon runner. You're saying,
Yeah, and the tour was a sprint at times and marathon at other, but I don't know if he would have been able to control that.
but talent-wise, he could have competed.
Oh, without a doubt.
How about I'm gonna give you one other guy from Jersey. Now, this guy bowled. I want to, and this is one of Parker's buddies. He bowled. I want to say maybe 3 years on tour before he quit. He won once. He made two shows. He made a double show with Parker, and he made a show on his own. And he won. And then he quit. Remember a guy named Dwayne Fisher?
Yes, I do.
Thoughts on Dwayne Fisher? Parker says it to this day. He would have had a Hall of Fame career if he stayed on tour. He was that good.
Here's the thing, and this is one of the things that people don't understand.
Okay.
There were Rich Wolf, unbelievable talent,
Fantastic.
unbelievable talent.
Best player to never win, right?
Absolutely. Him and Mark Thayer, my opinion. Okay, there was a difference between being able to compete on tour and living on tour.
Okay.
Living on tour was hard.
Well, you're living in a
It
facility
was
every week.
it was it was not, you're either filled all the time with being on the lanes, or you were filled, and I'm looking at it from a player's viewpoint, or you were filled with the time when you weren't on the lanes. Why am I not on the lanes?
Okay.
So it was completely consuming one way or the other. You're getting fatigued because you're bowling all the time, or you got the other one where you only made a check. Why didn't I bowl good enough to make a finals? And then of course the travel.
Yeah. So
The travel was, it's not like now where you have a cell phone and you can call everybody and you're in contact and texting. No,
sure.
you were isolated.
So going back to that era, I guess other guys that I wanted to bring up that I thought maybe resin might have hurt a little bit. Webb, uh,
But
where resin hurt him. Webb. Uh, I thought Ozio got affected a little bit. You said Palumbi, obviously. This guy, he won with resin a lot. But what about Amleto? Amleto was fantastic with urethane, rolling it out, right?
he
Did
would
resin
he,
hurt Amleto, or
yes, it
was he
did.
just too gifted, like because of his physical talent?
No, it hurt him.
Even though he won with it, you still think it hurt him.
Yes, because his, I wouldn't call it a weakness, but outside of his realm, throwing the bowling ball was harder. When he had to throw it hard, he just wasn't as good as when he could follow the flow. And his he was my first roommate on tour, by the way.
Okay. Did you ever go running with him?
I was in the truck drilling balls, man.
If Billy, if resin never came out, if resin was never invented, who would have the most titles on tour all time? Your opinion?
And if you're going with modern player,
Yeah,
ooh,
I
that's
mean, would it be
if
Pete?
resin never came out.
Would it be
All
Pete?
right, Pete Weber. Pete Weber. He was he's God given talent of a feel for the bottom of the swing better than anybody I've ever seen.
Just natural talent.
Just certain feel. That's the one thing that players aren't doing enough now is, you can describe to somebody what you feel.
Mhm.
You can describe to somebody what the feel is, but the only thing that can make the feel is the player. And a lot of people don't search it out enough. They are so caught up into what the oil pattern is, what layout are they using, and what baller they're throwing, that they haven't focused enough on what their feel of execution is.
The term shot maker was always big back in the 80s and the 90s, right? Like,
100%.
so Ferrara was a shot maker. Ozio, Voss was a shot maker, right?
Yes.
Is there such a thing, and I'll go into the modern game now, as a shot maker now?
No,
Your opinion, or just you don't think so?
I don't think so. I don't even have, I don't, because there's so much about, you know, I'll go with this. When it comes to playing the flip a spot and finding a spot on the lane where the ball flips back to the pocket, there's never been a better player at it with the reactive resin than EJ Tackett.
Okay,
You go to raw power. Nobody in my mind was ever better than Mark Roth.
okay.
You go with understanding rev control, angles, swing planes, walk patterns, and I'll go with Earl Anthony. You go with slow hook when it came to uh, plastic and urethane, Marshall Holman. When it comes to reactive resin, uh, Belmonte. So when people ask me who's the best of the best of the best, I don't think you can do that anymore.
No, you can't. It's too generationalized. It's so many factors, right?
Absolutely. And now you got 5 pound and plus cores in a bowling ball flipping to the center of the lane, and man, that's quite an advantage.
What about like a Frankie Lavoie or a Prather shot maker?
Shot maker.
And they have touch. Like those guys have touch. Like we talk
Yeah,
about Voss and whatnot. Voss had touch. Weber had touch.
yeah, but that's no longer rewarded.
That's what I was going to say to you. It's kind of like I don't want to say touch is obsolete, but it's kind of like you don't need to have it because the balls give it to you automatically now.
Absolutely. So there, what was once a lifetime driven goal has been eliminated. It's like right now, and I tell this to people, and boy, do I catch a lot of crap for it. There's two games available right now. Two: slow hook and throw it straight with no revs. They've taken, which is about 95% of the players that don't hook it enough and don't throw it straight enough, 95% of the field, which is tweeners, they've told them to go home. You got no chance.
Hmm.
When's the tweeners? When's the last time you saw a tweener dominate?
Yeah. No, you're not. You're right.
So there's two games available, and you better learn them both.
Billy, do you think I want to say this the right way, but I don't want to come off sounding like a jerk. The talent is greater now, or the talent was greater of the guys 20, 30 years ago?
I'll take the guys 20 to 30 years ago.
Is it because they had more tricks in the bag? Like I always
Yeah,
hear a lot of people say now, well, these guys don't know how to bowl. They don't have a B, a C, a D game. They have an A game. And when the A game's not there, they don't know how to cash a check with B, C, and D. But
well, there are some players that can do that, but they're
yes,
just not as good. They're not as good at it as, in my opinion, as the players from 20, 30 years ago.
so which? How about this one? 70s, 80s, 90s. What decade you think had the toughest talent? So I mean, you go to the 70s, you have uh, Roth, Earl, Don Johnson, Johnny. You go to the 80s, you could put Pete and Ozio and Webb and Holman. And you want to go to the 90s, you put Walter, Albee, Parker, Norm. Which group or what decade do you think had the most talent?
1970s.
Is it because of the balls? Because they had
Yeah,
to do more with the
it
ball?
was all about what you could do. There was no manipulating a pattern because that's what happens now. Um, I- Put it this way: I've never saw Earl Anthony throw a dull bowling ball.
And there was never Avalon pads back in the 70s either.
Yeah, you weren't sitting there manipulating a pattern, an oil on a lane by sandpaper using bowling balls that absorb it, so it creates a track.
And there were no reps in there either to tell them, hey, throw this thing, move it, right? There was no reps back in the 70s, obviously.
No, I was the first original full time rep.
Well, congratulations. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was in 1989 when I went to work for Hammer. Uh, they wanted me to work out of the office, and I said, "Well, actually, I think I could do better for you guys by going out and getting your equipment in the right players' hands, working with players, both men and women's tour." And that's what I ended up doing. So I was the first full time one. John Jowdy was out there on occasion, but I was the first full time one that opened up the field to it.
I want to go a couple more minutes because we're 90 minutes. I don't want to keep you any longer. So I asked you this earlier, so we'll do it now for people that are watching. Buddy of mine asked me today, and you gave me the answer. You're an encyclopedia. What bowling ball has won the most on the PBA tour?
Columbia Yellow Dot, because it was around for about 8 to 10 years, and there were weeks upon weeks where the only other ball was an ebonite, and it was in Earl Anthony's hands.
A lot of people when they have the goat conversation now, they don't talk about Earl really because it's almost like the Babe Ruth comparison. You always hear about Babe Ruth, but nobody ever saw him play. Well, everybody always hears about Earl, but never saw Earl bowl. How good was Earl?
Best bowler I've ever seen in my entire life.
Lefty or righty, best player,
best
period.
player. And I throw this story out, and people still don't believe me. We were in Rochester, New York, and he was just coming back out of his retirement. By the way, I still remember his grip. It was 4.5, 4 and 5/8, inch and a 32nd thumb, quarter reverse, half left, half right, zero front to back. His axis was 5 and 3/8 over and a quarter up. Okay, so he came out. I can't help it. I remember a lot of them. So he came out of retirement and he was warming up. And I walked down there and I just drilled his first bowling ball with an extra hole in it. And it was, let's just say, his comment was, "What the do I
Excellent.
do with this?" And I looked at him and I said, "You'll figure it out." So I went down and watched him, and because we were trying to make the balls flare,
Mhm.
and because they weren't built into the bowling balls. I go down there and I'm watching him, and he's been down there probably about 45 minutes to an hour, maybe somewhere around in there. So he says, he goes, "Yeah, I kind of like this." He goes, you want to see me blow the rack?" And I'm thinking, "Yeah, all right, sure." I'm looking. He did not move his feet. Shreds the rack, and then he says, "Hey, you want to see trip the six?" Sure. Trips the six, not moving anything. He
He did
goes,
it all with this.
he did it all by feel, touch, walk, and swing angles. He's the one that taught me how to divide players into four different sections from both the back and the side, and to understand how the spine is rotating and how everything was moving in a certain way. And I'll never forget this. We're in Dublin, California. He said to me, I'm asking him a couple questions, and he goes, "All right, so here's what I want you to do the next few days, and then come back to me when you have it." I said, "Okay." He goes, "Divide the player in half." I had no idea what that meant. So I'm standing back there and I'm watching. I go, about the middle of the second day, okay, I get it. And then I saw him the next morning. I walked up proudly going, "Okay, I understand. I divided the player in half and I was explaining what I saw from the back." And he goes, "Did you do it from the side yet?" I said, "No." And I walked away because you have to divide the player in four different ways because it's all how everything moves.
So he was just not to say ahead of his time, but he was just a genius when it came to all that stuff.
He was far ahead of his time, a genius, and his son Mike Anthony and I,
Great guy.
we still chat once in a while, and I always make sure to let him know how much I appreciate Mr. Anthony and what he taught me. I That's something that can't be forgotten.
All right, let's have a little fun before we wrap it up. We'll go like for another 5 more minutes. So you just gave Earl's grip, right? You
Yep,
remember Earl's grip like this. Who is the biggest pain in the ass to drill for on the truck?
Wayne Webb.
Really? No brainer, huh?
No, it didn't even take a second. Not even no,
You got to tell us why.
because he had a drill press in his trailer that he brought with him for a while.
Okay.
And we had, of course, the one on the truck.
Yeah.
Well, one day I said, "Wayne, something's, I don't know what's not right. I don't know." And he says, "All right, I'm going to drill a ball. I'm not going to work it out. You can put it on your press." And he gave me the numbers, which was a 45-degree oval. It was a 15/16 oval out to 31/30 seconds. So I said, "Okay, perfect." I put it on there. I line it up. His machine was set at that showed 45 was 43 on our machine degree oval. He could feel that.
Okay.
And if most players, you knew whether if you're going to cut the line, touch the line. Um, Wayne Webb, you better cut it dead in half. He
And
was that precise.
he could feel that.
He could feel it. Same with Norm Duke.
I've heard horror stories about Norm Duke drilling on the tour on the truck. I've heard horror stories about that.
He would say I would say he was the second hardest to drill for. The easiest, obvious, it
Yeah,
was
it was easy.
Amleto Monticelli, because when he once you handed him the ball and he went to go work it out, it looked like he opened it up with a hatchet. It was never it was never round. It was never smooth. The best workout on a bowling ball, and I'm talking precision, and it was unbelievable how much he made every ball feel the same, was Dave Davis.
Okay.
He worked it out with a file, and you couldn't tell whether it was done on a drill press or if he did it by hand. It was always perfect.
Just a man of his craft.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is, you know, like Marshall Holman, he was tough to drill for. He was very, very picky. Um, most of them, like Mark Roth, it was 5 different cuts on his thumb hole. Earl Anthony was 8, or I'm sorry, Ernie Slagle was 8 different cuts on his thumb hole. So it was all these different nuances that you had to deal with. And there was no, like, we had thumb solids, but there was no interchangeables. So you better get it right.
All right. So last one. So that's we talk about the guys drilling and whatnot. You got to give me one good story. What's the best fry out, flip out you ever seen on tour before? Let's have some fun.
Me,
You
me.
stop.
No, fried out. We were in.
Is it better than the John O'Drobanek story that I've heard with the wire brush?
Oh no, no. Okay, let me give you the best one that was comedic.
Okay.
And that was in uh, in Akron, Ohio, between Steve Cook and Larry Lickstein.
This can't be good.
Oh, it was. I never laughed so hard in my entire life. So Litchy, it's the end. Everybody, he's trying to collect. Guys are trying to go home. Bills are due for the ball drilling and the transport and the shirt cleaning and all that. And he's up. He's sitting there and he's going off. Now you got to remember, this is the last week after 16 weeks in a row. We're tired.
Yeah.
The players are tired. They want to go home. It was a short 3-week break before you started the summer. So, er, you know, it actually got annoying and grating by what Litchy was doing sitting behind the desk. And he was talking about, you owe me, everybody in here owes me, and he was just going ballistic. So I I look around the corner and here comes Steve Cook, and I'm thinking, well, he's going to pay him, and just to shut him up. That's not what happened. He walks over, literally picks Litchy up out of the chair. He's got one arm around his chest, another arm around his legs. Now we had bucket, a huge bucket there that they had the sodas in, the water in, and all
Okay.
that. And he literally picks him up, walks over to it. The ice is melted, and there's nothing but water in there. And he goes, "Litch, this is for you." And he literally dunked his head right into the bucket of ice water. So to me, they were both fried out because Steve was having a rough week and Litchy was having a rough week. And he literally dunked him a couple times and then stood him up and he goes, "Now I'll pay you."
And for those who don't know, Cook was what, 6'8"?
6'6", and one of the nicest guys you will ever meet. And it's like one thing that I learned when I first went out on tour is the wives were safe. They were always safe to hang around, and I had my favorites without a doubt. They were Tammy Albee, Pam Salvimini, Kim Weber, and a few others. Candy Cook. I spent time with them because they were safe to be around.
All right, so that's the good one. What's your fry out now? I mean, O'Drobanek, I've heard the story about how he was beating himself with a wire brush in the leg until he was bleeding through his pants.
And yelling at his bowling balls in the locker room. I'm not kidding.
So yours is better than that.
Well, we're in again. Firestone. Funny things always happen at the Firestone.
So Riviera is like the place. That's the Yankee
Oh
Stadium.
God,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, because you were fried out, 16 weeks straight, no days off. You're tired. You don't want to hear anything. You just want to get the job done. But I'm drilling a bowling ball for Gary Skidmore,
Okay.
and I'm replacing the slug because the slug, he had used it enough that it actually wore out a weird way, and he had used it enough. So I'm trying to reslug it. I put the first one in. I'm about halfway down. It spins out. Now again, I'm 16 weeks, and then I do the next one. It spins out. I do the third one. It spins out. Now I'm getting because they're getting ready to hit the lanes, and I'm getting pissed.
Mhm.
So then I get it all the way to the bottom. I go to drill out the very bottom piece. The slug spins out. This is the fourth one. I grab the ball out of the press. I throw it all the way to the back. And little did I know, Gary Skidmore was in the back waiting for his bowling ball. He looked at me, he goes, "That's my ball, right?" Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Do you have one good fry out on the lanes? I mean, like I said, Drobanek beating himself. Do you have one good player that just like here's the $100 for the fine. I don't care. Like I heard one guy, Nick Melnikoff was the one I've always heard.
The
I
best
don't
was
know if
Pete.
you were
No, the best was Pete Weber.
shocking. Well,
It was
we'll wrap up with this one. This has to be good, right?
yeah, because he went we're at Showboat Lanes, and he was, let's say, slightly inebriated.
Okay.
He goes, ring in 10, ring in 10, and I don't know what happened. He starts walking up and down the lanes, flipping off the entire. I mean, everybody, and yelling "F this, F that." If I leave another F in ring in 10, he's going crazy. And at the end of the building is Johnny Campos already writing it out. I thought, okay, well, they're still getting out of this one.
No, that's what I wanted, and that was the whole purpose of doing this whole show is to get stuff like that out in the open. So um, the next one, and one of the ones I'm working on, it's going to be a couple people at the same time, and you're familiar with these two, Hutch and Charlie Tapp,
Oh God.
and we're going to try. Charlie is working on this for me. Charlie is he's going to get Hutch. They're still close, and we're going to try to do it with Mike Miller and have all of them together.
The three greatest comedians on tour that there ever was.
And those guys, I mean, Hutch and Hutch and Charlie Tapp, they've done shows before. That's been great, but now I want to bring Mike Miller into it. Because everybody says Mike Miller was just zany and a goofball. You know, I want to hear the fun stuff now, and I've heard a boatload of stories about Miller and Charlie Tapp and Hutch and what they've done in the past. So that's going to be probably the next one we're going to do. So that's the whole purpose. We want to hear those kind of stories and appreciate the history of the game. And you were awesome, Billy. I mean, the information that you gave, I don't think anybody had any clue about all that stuff about the balls and the stuff that goes inside of it and using soot inside the ball,
Yep.
walnuts in the LT48. Nobody knew that stuff.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, and I really,
You're the best.
really hope to be back again someday, and
Yeah,
I'll
man.
definitely be listening.
Billy, if people want, I know you're in Vegas. If people are looking for you for anything, how can they find you? If you do lessons down in Vegas, right?
Yeah, Sunset Station, but my phone number is the best way to reach me, which is 702-885-2695.
And you can
Reach
look him
out,
up. Bill Hall on Facebook. Look him up. He's there too.
and I'm there too. And along with, of course, our group
Yep.
and my BH bowling page on Facebook. So, if you're looking to reach out, I'm always available.
Billy, you're the best. I'll give you a holler. I'll keep in touch. Stay cool out in Vegas. And thank you, everybody, for tonight. Billy, I'll keep in touch. And that's gonna wrap up the first show, guys. So everybody, thank you very much, and we'll be in touch.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks, Billy.